A wild Mustang thrashes in barbed wire. Blood stains the dirt. Rain falls, as if the sky itself is bearing witness. It doesn't run, doesn't scream. It simply lifts its head and looks straight at the human, as if to say, "Are you worthy?" This is not a rescue. It's a wild ritual, a test, where a human soul is measured by the silence of nature itself. One look that stops your heart, one gentle touch that turns your entire world inside out. They call it helping an animal, but maybe it was nature that summoned someone, not to save, but to remember, to record what this world tried to forget. And what you're about to hear is not a tale of survival, not a legend, but an ancient truth, where the wild doesn't need words, only a gaze to carry memory. And when it chooses to trust a human, it carves that trust into blood, into bone, into wind. Come with me into a land where silence speaks, and where, before it's over, you may find yourself asking, "Am I worthy to be remembered by the wild?" But before the wild could remember, one man had to forget everything. The eastern edge of Montana doesn't offer much to keep a man rooted, unless he's looking for somewhere to outrun the past. And that's exactly why Jonas Whitlock was there. A former military veterinarian who had served in Iraq, Jonas was now 47 years old. He lived alone in a weather-worn wooden cabin tucked against a hillside, where wind and the cry of hawks were his only companions. After a life filled with surgeries on the edge of death, surprise explosions, and the haunting images of animals writhing without anyone to save them, he had chosen retreat. A place where no one knew his name. A name. An old pickup truck. A past left unspoken. Jonas wasn't a loner by nature, but he had stopped looking for warmth in the world. Each day, he repeated the same patterns like breaths, mending fences, splitting wood, checking the chicken coop, and tying rope to posts, not out of necessity, but to remind himself he was still alive. That afternoon, the sky didn't darken gradually. It split open. No thunderclaps, no pressing storm clouds, just a strange stillness. The wind changed direction, the air thickened, and the sparrows on the power lines scattered in a sudden blur like something was terribly wrong. Jonas was driving back from the tiny town of Eddington, 30 miles away, where he had traded a bale of hay for a jar of honey. His truck rattled along the dirt road, tires groaning against the ruts, and wind whistled through the cracked window. Then the headlights caught something, movement. A twitch. A ripple in the dry roadside grass that shouldn't have been there. He slammed on the brakes. Somehow, instinct overrode reason. Jonas climbed out of the truck, bringing nothing but his gut. That was when he saw it. A wild horse, its coat a smoky gray, its black mane matted with sweat and dirt, was thrashing violently against a rusted barbed wire fence. One of its front legs had become entangled in the coiled wire, so deep that the white of bone was nearly visible. Blood soaked the cracked earth beneath it, turning patches of dust into dark crimson sludge under the spitting rain. But what rooted Jonas in place was the look in the horse's eyes. Not pleading, not simple fear, but a strange cocktail of pain, challenge, survival instinct, and pride. Jonas didn't move. No one had ever taught him how to stand before a wounded Mustang, but he knew one thing: a single misstep, and he could take a kick that shattered his ribs, if the horse had any strength left at all. He dropped into a crouch and drew a long, steady breath. "I'm not here to take anything from you, kid," he murmured, more to himself than the horse. The Mustang snapped its head, sending another gush of blood down its leg. Its ears were pinned forward, and its whole body trembled like it was gritting its teeth. Jonas slowly slipped his hand into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pair of old wire cutters, the same ones he'd once used to remove rusted chain collars from rescue dogs years ago. "All right, just a little more," he whispered. With every inch he moved forward, the horse shook harder. But it didn't back away. It stared him down, silent defiance. Jonas dropped to one knee. His left hand gripped the fence lightly. His right hand went to work. Snap. The first coil popped. The horse let out a guttural, wounded sound, half snort, half scream, and jerked its head violently. But it didn't lash out. Didn't flee. Jonas said nothing. The rain grew heavier. Wind howled against his coat, but he barely noticed. Snap. Snap. The final loop of wire came free. The horse collapsed to one side. Jonas instinctively stepped back. The animal panted hard, its entire frame shaking like a dying machine. Its head dipped to the ground, then slowly rose again. The wounded leg was bleeding badly, but it wasn't broken. Jonas held his breath. And then, the Mustang staggered to its feet, leaning on three legs, wobbling, shaking its head. And then, it walked. Each step was a surge of pain, but still, it came closer. Its eyes locked onto Jonas, step by step, until it stood just a few feet from him. Jonas didn't move. And then, without a sound, the Mustang bowed its head and gently pressed its muzzle against Jonas's chest. Soft, brief, but like a breath being passed from one soul into another. Jonas exhaled sharply. In his lifetime, he'd been thanked with tears, with medals, with flowers. But never with the touch of something wild. He couldn't speak. There was no need to. The Mustang stepped back. One pace. Then another. Jonas was still frozen when he heard the sound behind him. Hoofbeats. Deep. Measured. Heavy. He turned. On the mist-covered hill, 5 wild horses stood in formation. Silent. Unmoving. Each one looked like a relic from another time. A towering white stallion, its mane blowing like smoke. A chestnut mare with a long scar carved from shoulder to flank. A tiny foal trembling behind another's leg. A jet-black Mustang, standing firm, eyes fixed. And a golden buckskin with a thick mane spilling past its shoulders. They didn't charge. They didn't flee. They had seen everything. And in that moment, Jonas felt a cold rush down his spine. Not from the rain, but from the overwhelming truth. He wasn't watching them. They were watching him. Ancient eyes. Wild laws. Unspoken memory. Then, the gray Mustang turned toward the herd and let out a sharp cry, not loud, but purposeful. The others answered in unison, a harmony of hoofbeats and calls carried by the wind like some wild hymn only the truly free could ever hear. Jonas Whitlock, once a man with nothing left to give, had just been chosen by the wild. And deep down, He knew. From this moment on, something inside him would never be the same. The rain had stopped, but the earth was still wet, and Jonas's heart was still trembling. He stood there, in the field torn open by instinct and blood, with the first look from the wild horse still burned into his mind. His chest held the warmth of that brief touch, a simple nudge of the muzzle, yet heavy with meaning, like an ancient ritual, silent and sacred. And then, he turned around. On the mist-veiled ridge, amidst yellowed, wilted grass, 5 wild horses stood. No sound. No rustling wind. No greeting. Only presence, as if they had been there since before men ever walked the earth. Jonas felt the blood drain from his face. His back stiffened, not from fear, but from a pressure he couldn't name. As if the beings before him didn't belong to this world, but to a sacred memory of the land. 5 horses. 5 living emblems. Each carried in their stance memory, history, and law, things even a healer like him had never truly touched. At the center stood a brilliant white stallion, so tall it made the sky behind him seem to retreat. Its coat wasn't pure white, but a silver mist, like fog, like smoke, like the ashes of something ancient that had burned away and left only dignity behind. Every toss of its head was like a drumbeat from prehistory. Not fierce, not gentle, just absolute majesty. Jonas didn't know why, but in his heart, he called him Argent, the memory of silver. To the left, slightly smaller, stood a red-roan mare, compact in size but with eyes like rusted blades, eyes that had once cut clean through the souls of trespassers. Her steps made no sound, not because she was light, but because she had learned how to exist without drawing notice. A creature that survived on sheer resilience and memory. Jonas couldn't hold her gaze for long, but he knew she had seen loss, and she never forgave what the world chose to forget. In his mind, he named her Sira, the Watcher of Shadows. Among them stood a lanky young colt, coat the color of faded earth, limbs still shaky, its short mane barely grown in. But in those young eyes was a blend of trembling and fierce curiosity. It clung to the leg of the black horse beside it, but didn't hide. It stared at Jonas. It stared straight into him. And that made Jonas's throat tighten. Foals always looked at the world with wonder. But this gaze, it wasn't just curiosity. It was acknowledgement. He called the colt Wren, the dawn wind. Behind Wren stood a pure black horse, without a single marking. Its mane hung like uncut night, its body a map of hard muscle and stillness. Its eyes were endless pits of ink. Unblinking. It didn't move. Didn't even breathe heavily. It just stood, as if it had been carved into time itself. Jonas couldn't hold its stare for more than a few seconds. Each glance pulled him into a world without sound or light, only duty, discipline, and instinct. He named it Thorn, the wind's thorn. At the far right stood a golden buckskin, with a thick mane that fell to its chest. On its left flank was a long scar, deep and wide, as if heaven itself had struck it with a blade. Its every movement was slow, not out of weakness, but because it had grown used to pain. And in its eyes, Jonas saw something he knew intimately well, the quiet acceptance of those who had given everything, and chose never to speak of it. He called this one Elias, the keeper of what was lost. 5 spirits. 1 herd. A world apart. Jonas stood among them. A man. An outsider. And he could feel himself being measured, not for who he was, but for what he had just done, something the wild horses had never expected. The gray, the one he had freed, turned its head. Blood still ran, but its gaze had changed. It was clearer now. Less wild, but no less proud. Then it let out a call, sharp, short, but not aggressive. It was a message. A witness. An invitation. He didn't hurt me. He listened. He chose to help. And then, the entire herd answered. Not wildly. Not in chaos. But in deep, resonant harmony, their voices echoing across the ridgeline like bells rung by ghost hands. Jonas nearly dropped to his knees. He had never seen anything like this. These were not just animals. This was ceremony. And somehow, this ceremony was for him. The white stallion, Argent, stepped forward first. Each hoofstep seemed to pass through time itself. The wind lifted the ends of his silver mane. When he stood just 2 lengths away, he stopped, raised his head high, and then he bowed. Slow, deliberate. Not from fear, not from weakness, but from recognition. The red mare Mare circled him twice, silent, close, sharp-eyed. The blackthorn didn't move, but its subtle nod was like a punch to Jonas's chest. The scarred buckskin Elias lowered its head, turned away slowly, as if saying goodbye to a long-lost comrade. And finally, the colt, Ren, stepped forward. No hesitation, and stared right into Jonas's eyes. In that moment, Jonas forgot the cold. Forgot the fading light. Forgot the old wound in his shoulder throbbing from the rain. All he knew was, he had just stepped into something mankind forgot centuries ago. No horse looked back. No one gave an order. No leader broke from the line. The entire herd turned in unison, and, one by one, vanished into the mist. Only the gray lingered. It turned its head one final time. Its eyes, no longer afraid. No longer uncertain. Only carrying one silent message. I'll return. And it disappeared. Jonas Whitlock, veterinarian, recluse, silent man, stood in the field like a statue of breath. And for the first time in 2 decades, he didn't feel like an outsider. He had been seen. The next morning, the sky was crystal clear, as if the storm had never happened. The earth still smelled damp. The grass, flattened under the hooves of wild horses, had begun to lift under the early sun. But inside the old wooden cabin near the tree-line, Jonas Whitlock hadn't slept a wink. He sat motionless. His boots were still muddy. His coat, slung over the back of a chair, hung damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of horse. A cup of coffee had gone cold beside him. His weathered hand rested loosely on the table. His eyes stared into nothing, or perhaps into a memory that kept looping through his mind like a silent film, replaying every look, every bow, every unspoken gesture that refused to fade. He could still feel it, the muzzle of the gray horse pressing gently into his chest. Soft, fleeting, but somehow still there, like a sacred imprint. Every horse has its own way of disappearing. They don't run. They don't rush. They just slip into the mist, leaving behind a void echoing with presence. Jonas couldn't forget the last look the gray horse gave him before vanishing into the trees. It wasn't goodbye. It was a promise. I'll come back. 2 days passed. Not a single horse. Just wind and silence. Jonas returned to his daily rhythms, fixing the chicken coop roof torn by wind, replacing a broken window latch, cleaning up debris from the storm. But inside him, everything had changed. From the way he stepped on gravel, to how he stared into the forest each morning, or how he froze when a faint sound of hoofbeats echoed faintly in the distance. On the third morning, while gathering fallen branches near the eastern treeline, a place few ever wandered because of how thick the woods grew, Jonas spotted something in the mud. Hoofprints. He stopped cold. They were clear, deep, sharp-edged. Not from domestic horses. Mustangs. His heart pounded. Something inside him, something primal and unspoken, told him to follow. The path twisted through lowlands slick with mossy rocks and crossed a narrow stream now swollen from the storm. Jonas followed the hoofprints step by step. He didn't rush. He didn't question. It was as if he wasn't walking with will, but with a thread pulled straight from his heart into the wild. After nearly an hour, the trail opened into a small clearing, where the trees parted and the sunlight pierced down in a perfect circle of gold on damp earth. And in the center of that clearing, Jonas stopped dead. There, laid in quiet stillness, was a pile of white bones. Not human. Not the remains of a predator's kill. No blood. No decay. Just bones. Arranged. Deliberate. Intentional. And right in the center of those bones was Jonas's wire cutter. The very tool he had used to free the gray Mustang. Jonas couldn't remember when he dropped it. The last time he recalled having it was when he'd stepped back and let the gray horse rise. He thought he'd put it in his pocket. But now, there it was, resting in the circle of bones, like an offering. Jonas knelt slowly. His hand trembled as he reached for the cutter. It wasn't rusty. It wasn't caked in mud. It was clean. Placed with care. The bones weren't scattered. He looked closer. A small skull, perhaps a foal's. Beside it, ribs. Leg bones. A worn vertebra. A scapula thinned with time. No teeth marks. No disruption. No violence. Every piece had been laid with intent, like a ritual. Jonas exhaled slowly. And then it hit him, a feeling he hadn't expected, gratitude. But not his. The horse's. We remember. We are grateful. A soft breeze stirred the leaves. And then, from the edge of the woods, the gray Mustang appeared. He walked slowly, still limping, but taller somehow. His eyes brighter. He looked at Jonas. No rush. No sound. And from behind him, 3 more horses emerged. Syrah, the red mare. Ren, the young colt. And a new figure, a deep brown mare, slender, calm, with eyes like still water. Beside her, a newborn foal, barely as tall as Jonas, kneeling. Its coat still soft with down, its steps unsteady. Jonas didn't move. The gray Mustang stepped forward, and with his muzzle, nudged the wire cutter toward Jonas. It was unmistakable. Not a coincidence. A choice. Jonas picked it up, hands trembling. And in that moment, he understood. They don't just remember. They keep their word. He looked again at the bones. Perhaps it had been a burial site. A member of their herd. A lost foal. No one would ever know. Except them, the ones who live in the fog, who carry memories no one teaches, and speak stories no one else can tell. Jonas looked at the gray. You brought me here to see something no one's ever seen. The Mustang didn't reply. He didn't need to. His eyes held invitation, trust, tradition. Jonas felt it, deep and real. This wasn't about taming. It wasn't about rescuing. It was about remembering. About bearing witness. About telling the story. Before the herd turned to leave, the newborn foal stepped toward Jonas, close enough for him to hear its gentle, raspy breath. No fear. No hesitation. Jonas leaned down, not raising a hand. The foal sniffed his chest, the same way the gray had done. Then turned and followed its mother into the trees. When the horses had vanished behind the leaves, Jonas remained kneeling, wire cutter in hand, eyes fixed on the white bones. He no longer felt like he was in a forest. He felt like he was standing in a graveyard of souls. Jonas Whitlock had once stepped across the boundary between man and horse. But it was at the place where he found the bone shrine that something deeper awakened within him, not a memory, but a calling. A calling with no shape, no name, no voice, yet echoing through every half-waking dream. That night, for the first time in years, Jonas dreamed. He was standing in the middle of a sun-scorched desert, no wind, no shade. Ahead of him, a wild horse was running, chased, cornered, driven toward a cliff, its eyes wild with panic. And then, a gunshot. Blood sprayed across the sand. The horse collapsed. Jonas jolted awake. His body soaked in sweat. His hand clenched the wire cutter, the one he'd kept beside his bed ever since the encounter at the bone shrine. The next morning, he didn't go to town as planned. Instead, he followed tracks. Faint hoof prints, softened by the night's rain, led him through a narrow rock corridor, where the forest gave way to vertical stone faces covered in moss, like the forgotten walls of an ancient tomb. There were no roads, no signs, no footprints. Yet Jonas felt, somehow, like he'd been here before, in a dream. As he made his way deeper through the passage, the light began to fade, replaced by a soft green glow filtering through the canopy above. Jonas stopped when he reached a natural hollow in the rocks, sunken slightly, covered in wildflowers that didn't grow anywhere else in the region. At the center, under a patch of lichen and loose stone, was a flat slab of rock, tilted just so, like a gravestone. And draped across it, a weathered leather halter. Jonas knelt. His fingers trembled as he touched the softened leather, worn by time. But on the inner side, etched deep and unmistakable, were the letters, L.A. He frowned. Not a name. Not a place. But the symbol. He'd seen it once before, in an old wildlife enforcement document. L.A. stood for Lost Acquisition, a code used for wild horses illegally captured and removed from the system. In other words, dead. Jonas sat heavily on the ground. Cold sweat rolled down his spine. A chill pierced through both layers of his shirt, despite the warm sun above. This is the grave of a horse that was betrayed. And someone, or some group of horses, remembered. Something stirred inside Jonas. These animals didn't just survive. They remembered. They grieved. They put truth back in its place. With silence, with ritual, with grass and stone. From that night on, Jonas dreamed again and again. Each dream, a fragment of something lost. A herd being chased by helicopters. The sound of groaning in a forest at midnight. A horse locked in a tiny stall, skin stretched over ribs, staring at him as if begging to be saved. Some nights, he became that horse, thrashing in a pen, legs restrained, back bleeding from a whip. He would wake up gasping, chest burning, as if wildness itself had trampled across him. He didn't tell anyone. No one would believe it. But Jonas knew these weren't ordinary nightmares. They were memories being passed down. Somehow, the spirits of the horses who had lived and died were trying to speak again through him. One day, he returned to the grave, this time bringing incense. Not because he believed, but because something in him said it was right. He lit the incense, set it beside the altar, and bowed his head. "I'm sorry for not knowing you were here sooner." The wind stirred from nowhere, and from behind the trees, the gray Mustang appeared. But not alone. The entire herd had come back. No one pushed them. No one cried out. They stood still, each one around the grave. Motionless. Unblinking. As if they were keeping watch over a soul that hadn't yet moved on. And Jonas understood. Wild horses don't forget. They hurt. They know. And they wait. The young colt, Ren, stepped forward again. But this time, instead of touching his chest, he pressed his nose to Jonas's shoulder. The very spot where a war injury still ached from time to time. Jonas nearly choked. "You know I was a lost soul once too, don't you?" That night, Jonas didn't dream of wounded horses. He dreamed of a herd galloping across the plains. Free. Unbound. No humans on their backs. And leading them was a giant white stallion, its eyes shining like the wind itself. And in the dream, a voice whispered something Jonas had never dared to believe. If horses can forgive, then maybe people can change. 3 weeks after Jonas had stumbled upon the pile of bones and the leather halter etched with LA, the grave of the betrayed horse had become a place he returned to each week. No one asked him to. No one went with him. But Jonas kept coming back, lighting incense, brushing clean the stone marker, and standing silently like a lone sentinel for souls yet to pass on. The dreams of wounded horses grew fewer. In their place came fleeting glimpses of green plains, herds running in quiet unity, and the wind whispering through his chest like it was singing. Then one morning, as the wind shifted and Jonas was trimming weeds near the chicken coop, he heard it. Not a whinny. Not a snort. But a call. When Jonas stepped outside, he saw the gray Mustang had returned. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a deep brown mare and a foal barely steady on his legs. The foal stumbled clumsily, its pale golden coat still fluffy, with large round eyes and a white drop-shaped mark on its forehead. The foal looked at Jonas, and Jonas looked back. This was not a chance encounter. This was an offering. The gray stepped toward the fence. Jonas stayed still. None of the three grazed. None sniffed the wind. They just stood. Then the gray turned his head and nudged the foal gently into the open paddock. The mare hesitated, but eventually followed. Jonas quietly opened the side gate, his heart pounding as if stepping into something he couldn't ever undo. The gray looked at Jonas for a long moment. Then he left. He didn't look back. Jonas wiped the tears from his eyes. He knew this foal wasn't just repayment for what he had done. This was a living legacy. He named the foal Ekko, not because he mimicked sounds, but because he was the echo of something that had already happened. The echo of wildness. The echo of the gray soul. And perhaps Jonas's own. Ekko was unlike any foal Jonas had ever met. He didn't fear him. He didn't flinch when approached. He didn't startle at touch. Jonas didn't train him. Didn't teach him to follow, to turn, to stand. And yet he did all of it. When Jonas walked, Ekko followed. When Jonas sat, Ekko came close and bowed his head. When Jonas whispered his name like a breeze, Ekko lifted his face, as if he understood. Every morning, Ekko greeted him with a single high-pitched whinny. Short, clear, bright. Just like the gray had done on that fateful day. The mare, Jonas called her Celia, remained cautious but calm. She allowed him to touch her nose, her neck. When Ekko was near, she stood still, as if trust had passed from son to mother. Ekko grew fast. Every day was a new chapter. Jonas began writing things down, not like a scientist, but like someone trying to preserve something sacred. He noted every milestone. The first time Ekko ran. The day he crossed a creek without stumbling. The moment he called out toward the edge of the forest for the very first time. Each night, Jonas still placed the wire cutter and the halter with LA etched into it beside his bed. A vow that he would not let the world forget. One golden afternoon, as sunlight bathed the paddock, Jonas saw Ekko staring out toward the pine ridge, where the deep woods began. Ekko's eyes no longer looked like a foal's. They were the eyes of a guardian. Jonas approached, laid a hand gently along his neck, and whispered, "You won't stay here forever. I know. But before you go, the world will know you were here." A few weeks later, a young girl, daughter of an old friend, came to visit the ranch. When she saw Ekko, she froze. "He's not like other horses," she said. Jonas nodded. "Can I draw him?" she asked. Jonas raised his eyebrows, then smiled. "As long as I get a copy." A week later, she mailed him 3 drawings. One of Ekko standing beneath the pine trees, looking into something unseen. One of Ekko touching noses with Jonas's outstretched hand. And the last, Ekko standing among wild horses, with light falling only on him. Beneath that last image, she had written, "Ekko carries what humankind forgot, and gives it back through his gaze." Jonas framed it, hung it by the fireplace, next to the cutter, next to the halter. 3 markers on a path he never expected to walk. Ekko grew stronger, taller. And with each passing day, he resembled the gray moor in his gait, in the way he turned his head, in the calm intensity of his stare. And Jonas understood. Legacy isn't just what we leave behind. It's what we nurture until it can walk on its own. One day, Ekko would return to the forest. He would lead. He would bow before someone new, just as the gray had bowed once before. And when that time came, Jonas would not stop him. Because he knew. Horses don't belong to people. But sometimes, if you listen long enough, they'll give you a piece of their soul. When autumn rolled across the hills of Montana, Jonas Whitlock began to write. Not for a book. Not to seek credit. He wrote because he felt that if he didn't, everything that had happened would disappear, like morning mist off a horse's back. Every night, he sat by the fireplace, Ekko curled up at his feet, and tapped away on an old typewriter, something he'd dug up from storage like he was digging up the part of himself he'd long forgotten. With each line, he captured the moments, the first look from the gray Mustang, the silent bow in the field, the warm breath that had touched his chest and reignited something he thought was long cold. He wrote about the bone altar, about dreams that didn't feel like his, and about Ekko, the foal who felt like a living echo of something far bigger than any one man. When the first draft was finished, he emailed it to a handful of old friends, former members of an animal rescue team, a few from the BLM wildlife station, and one he hadn't seen in 10 years who was now a biologist in Colorado. No one responded right away. Jonas didn't expect them to. But 3 days later, a message came, just one line. "You're not crazy. And I think the world needs to hear this." The following week, a silver Jeep pulled up at the gate. Out stepped a slim woman in a dusty khaki jacket, a camera slung across her chest, Celia Brooks, a journalist known for her work on wildlife and environmental stories. Celia had written about orphaned elephants in Kenya, packs of street dogs in India, and had once won an award for her expose on the illegal Mustang trade in Nevada. She shook Jonas's hand, eyes sharp but calm. "I'm not here for a headline," she said. "I just want the truth. From you. From them." Jonas smiled. "Then you've come to the right place." Celia stayed for 2 days. She didn't ask many questions. She watched. She listened. She photographed the bone shrine only after Ekko led her to it, not with a halter, but with his eyes. "That colt, it was like he knew where I needed to go," Celia whispered. Jonas nodded. "I've never once shown him the way." Later, by the fire, Celia pointed to the old wire cutter hanging above the mantel. "Why do you still keep that?" Jonas looked outside toward Ekko, sleeping peacefully near the barn, his chest rising and falling like dreams were passing through with every breath. "Because I was given a story," he said. "And I won't lose it again." 2 weeks later, Celia's article hit the front page of Earth Witness. "They remember, a Mustang's gift to the man who listened." The piece spread faster than Jonas could have ever imagined. In less than 72 hours, it had over 1 million shares, was translated into 8 languages, and featured on the homepages of National Geographic, BBC Earth, and even The Atlantic. But what stunned Jonas the most were the comments. Thousands of people began to tell their own stories. A man from Oregon wrote, "I once found an injured horse near the Columbia River. I thought I imagined it when it came back the next winter, with a foal. Now I'm not so sure it was just coincidence." A woman from Australia said, "My husband called me crazy when I told him a herd of wild horses circled my tent all night and never left. They didn't harm me. They just stayed." A 12-year-old boy from Canada sent in a drawing. A horse standing under a star-filled sky, a teardrop-shaped marking on its forehead. "I saw him in my dream. His name is Ekko." Jonas was overwhelmed. The story was no longer his. It was alive, echoing through other people's memories, turning what had once been dismissed as fantasy into something that now had a name, belief. Ekko was now nearly Jonas's height. His coat had shed its fuzz, but his eyes had only deepened, like wind threading through ancient layers of memory. Every evening, he lifted his head toward the pine ridge, where the old path remained unblocked. Jonas knew that day would come. Ekko would leave. But this time, he wasn't afraid. Because now he understood. When you truly listen to the wild, it doesn't just give you a story. It gives you a truth the world forgot. 1 month after Celia Brooks published her article, Jonas Whitlock did something he once swore he'd never do. He opened the gates of his ranch and invited the world in. Not to be praised, not to turn pain into performance, but to pass on something that words could no longer hold. A fragile thread of trust between man and the wild. Jonas sat beneath the porch roof, at a weathered wooden table, writing each invitation by hand. No printer. No typing. The ink soaked into the paper like breath. He sent exactly 17 letters. Not by chance, but by choice, each recipient a piece of the strange spiritual journey he had found himself on. Each one representing a world Jonas once thought he'd left behind. A former vet who once helped him pull a horse from hurricane wreckage in Texas. A biologist who spent 20 years studying Mustangs in the Mojave Desert. A documentary filmmaker who made a series about abandoned wild animals. An elderly couple near the Canadian border who adopted a neglected horse and cared for it until its final breath. A blacksmith who had once shod Mustangs rescued from illegal auctions. An elementary school teacher whose class drew pictures of horses after reading Celia's story. A 12-year-old girl who sent Jonas a drawing that read, "The wild gave him a voice." A retired writer who spent 6 months alone in the forest, just to observe wild horses. A sculptor who once carved a Mustang from memory after dreaming of it for weeks. A man from Oregon who had written in the article comments about a Mustang that returned one winter, with a foal. A young veterinarian who volunteered at illegal rescue shelters. A photographer who once captured an entire herd surrounding a campsite. A woman from Australia who mailed Jonas the ashes of the last Mustang she ever saw. A boy from Canada who dreamed of a horse named Ekko, and drew it. A blind poet who once said, "I don't need to see the horse to feel what it's saying." A former horse hunter who stopped after reading the article. A grieving mother who said Ekko made her feel her lost son was still watching over her, somewhere in the fields. Each letter bore the same simple message. Come. Not to hear my story, but to listen to theirs, the spirits still running through these meadows, carrying the words no one else has heard. On the day of the gathering, the sky was a soft gray. The wind from the pines carried a chill like a whisper from ancestors. No podium. No microphones. No banners. Just an open clearing in front of the barn, a few old wooden benches, some steaming pots of tea. And Ekko, standing still in the field, his head held high, eyes fixed on something far away. Celia Brooks was the first to arrive, this time without her camera. Next came the elderly couple, carrying a faded wooden frame with their late horse's photo inside. The man from Oregon arrived late, with a hand-carved plank in his arms that read, "Spirit Lives." The 12-year-old girl came too, clutching a leather sketchbook. Inside it, a brand new drawing, Ekko standing in the rain beside an ancient pile of horse bones. At the bottom, in violet ink, it read, "The wild gave him a voice. He gave it back." Jonas didn't open with a speech. He simply stepped into the clearing, placed a hand on Ekko's neck, and spoke quietly. "I once thought I saved a horse. Now I know. I was chosen to share what wild horses have been trying to say for generations. That they remember. that they hurt, that they forgive, not because they forget, but because they want us to remember in the right way. Ekko didn't neigh, but he raised his head, eyes meeting each guest one by one, not in fear, not in demand, but in clarity and grace. Then, as if summoned from another world, the wild horses appeared. No one called them. No reins. No ropes. They stepped from the tree line, soft but certain, as if time itself bowed to let this moment unfold. The gray led the way. Behind him, the black stallion, the chestnut mare, the golden buckskin, Celia the mother, and several others, among them a young colt with budding horns. They lined up along the fence. No cries. No hesitation. No lowering of eyes. They bowed. One more time. Silence settled across the clearing. Rain fell evenly on backs, both human and horse, on hands held over hearts. Someone cried. Then another. And soon, no one tried to hide it. Not from grief, but because in that moment everyone knew they had been forgiven. Later, Celia handed Jonas a folded note, the handwriting a little shaky. Truth doesn't have to shout. Sometimes, it only needs a horse standing still in the rain. Jonas read it. He didn't reply. He just nodded. The next day, he walked into the field. Ekko stood alone in the tall grass, back turned to the barn, head raised toward the pine ridge. The wind caught his mane. Ears alert. Eyes deep, like a breeze brushing through an old legend. Jonas stepped beside him, laid his hand on the colt's shoulder, and whispered, "I hear you now. And I won't forget. We spend so much of our lives trying to control things. To name, to tame, to own, to define. But maybe some of the most powerful connections are the ones we never planned, never expected, and could never explain. A man once saved a Mustang, but it was the Mustang who gave him something to believe in again. Not with words, not with promises, but with a breath and a look that said, I see you, and I trust you. In a world so loud, where everything demands your attention, maybe the wild has been whispering the answers all along. So when life gets too loud, listen for the quiet hoofbeats in your own heart. They may be leading you back to something real. And if you ever feel lost, remember this. The wild doesn't belong to us. But if we stand still long enough, sometimes it chooses to walk beside us. Speech balloon if this story spoke to something inside you. Leave us a comment below. Share it with someone who still believes in the magic of unspoken bonds. And don't forget to subscribe to Gallop of Glory, where every story brings you closer to the wild soul of the world.